Hello and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar series hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between the biennial National Adaptation Forum gatherings. You can visit National Adaptation Forum at www.nationaladaptationforum.org to learn more about past webinars, past forums, including our most recent gathering this past April 2019 in Madison, Wisconsin. We are already beginning to plan for the 2021 forum, so please stay tuned for more details as they unfold. My name is Lauren Lynch, one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is Leading with Stories, the story of Colton Jones and the role of storytelling in the struggle for climate justice. This is part 2 of our climate equity series. Part 1 took place in March and focused on the intersection of climate change, poverty, and homelessness. In that webinar, presenters discussed the health impacts of wildfires and how the unhoused and farm workers are some of the most impacted by the air pollution, which is being exacerbated with climate change. Today's webinar will look beyond statistics and at the life of Colton Jones, who was directly impacted by the Northern California fires in 2017 while working on a farm. Before we get started, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please place your phone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce any feedback. If you are using a microphone voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute, even if you are listed as muted when logged in. We will have plenty of time after the presentation for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit questions to the presenter. We will do our best to answer all of the questions. You can also type questions into the chat box for us to pull from. You can also use the chat box to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We will try our best to help you address any problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees as a way to emphasize a point heard during the presentation. We encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. And then finally, I wanted to let you know that we will be recording and posting the webinar in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. The webinar should be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. The presentation will also be available online as PDFs on the EcoAdapt website at ecoadapt.org/webinars. Additionally, we wanted you to be aware that American Planning Association certification maintenance credits are available for the webinar today. Please message us through the chat box or email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org if you have any questions. Next slide, Molly. I am pleased to introduce Keegan McChesney, the presenter for today's webinar. Keenan is a program fellow at Enterprise Community Partners, a national nonprofit focused on affordable housing and community development. Based in Los Angeles, his work centers on community-driven development that advances racial equity, environmental justice, and climate resilience. Keegan has worked for a number of community-based organizations, including Strategic Actions for a Just Economy and Inner City Struggle. He has also worked for Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti and the Seattle Department of Parks and Recreation. Keegan earned a master's through the Joint International Masters in Sustainable Development program, where he specialized in climate science and urban planning at universities in Germany, Italy, and India. He also holds a bachelor's degree in urban and environmental policy from Occidental College in Los Angeles. Thanks, and you can take it away, Keegan.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hope so.
Yes,
thanks,
we can
Lauren,
hear you.
for wonderful. Okay. Thanks, Lauren, for that introduction, and thank you to the National Adaptation Forum team for inviting me to present today. I also want to say thank you and give a quick shout out to Tiny, aka Lisa Gray Garcia, and I encourage folks to listen to the last webinar that Tiny and Dr. Hoy Faye Mock did on wildfires, poverty, and homelessness. It was a really powerful presentation, and I'm humbled to follow in their footsteps, and I think it transitions perfectly into today's story. Finally, I want to thank everyone on the webinar today for taking time to hear this story. I hope it will move and inspire you. Before I begin, I just want to warn folks that this presentation includes some graphic, violent, and potentially triggering content. Please advise. Again, my name is Keegan McChesney, and I'm here today to tell you about a story about my friend, Colton Jones. In an effort to connect to each other across the virtual divide, I want us all to close our eyes for a few seconds. I invite everyone to take a deep breath. Just acknowledge your breath and what a blessing it is to breathe healthy air, which I hope you all have access to right now. I want you to ask yourself why you decided to join this webinar today. Why do you care about climate change, equity, and adaptation? Why do you do the work that you do? And while your eyes are still closed, think of one person that motivates you or inspires you to do this work. One person who inspires me is Colton Jones. Now please open your eyes. Today's webinar is about stories. We all have a story to tell. Stories are what connect and motivate us. Stories bring life to the issues we care about. Stories, unlike data and numbers, tap into our emotions. Storytelling is used across history and across cultures. Stories remind us of our own humanity and the humanity of others. Climate change tends to be described using statistics and scientific rhetoric. Victims of climate disasters are all too often reduced to numbers. I believe that data can sometimes be debilitating, while stories, on the other hand, can inspire action. This is the story of Colton Jones. Next slide, please. This is a photo of my beautiful friend, Colton Jones, who is known by friends as CJ. He is a powerful activist, organizer, artist, and healer. At just 26 years of age, CJ has touched innumerable lives in profound ways, including my own. In October of 2017, CJ was working on a farm in Northern California when a regional firestorm erupted. The fires produced thick smoke and particulate matter, creating an environment of unhealthy air. Inhaling this toxic air triggered a severe asthma attack that eventually sent CJ into cardiac arrest. His final words on the way to the hospital were, "I can't breathe." The track you are about to hear is a poem written and recorded by CJ and produced by his friend John. The poem is titled, "Who Am I?"
This question, who am I? Who am I? I guess I really couldn't tell you who I am without telling you who I was, and I couldn't tell you who I was unless I told you where I come from. Come from until I told you where they come from, and where they come from, and where they come from. And I guess you really wouldn't know who I was until we looked deep, deep, far back into the story of the universe. The stories before the colonization, the stories before the commodification, stories in harmony, not only with each other, but with the birds and the bees, with the flowers and the trees. I guess if I were to tell you who I was, I would have to tell you that being here and now doesn't really feel like home. It sort of feels like a distant space, like we're floating through space and we've got so many masks on. our face. We're just so afraid of seeing one another, and in the process we're so afraid of seeing ourselves. I mean, what the hell? Like, who are we to think that we are greater than we can ever realize, that we are greater than we can even fathom? It's much easier to get in our way. It's much easier to doubt ourselves. It's much easier to be insecure. So who am I? Who am I? I am but a dream. A dream. Floating on this crazy organism, this spaceship called Earth, having a human existence in this black body, this scarred body, this traumatized body, this optimistic body, this sexy body. Who am I? Who am I? Neither a girl nor a guy, or maybe I am both a guy and a girl, and I am everything that has ever existed in the world in one being. I take on many different forms. May I not be attached to any of them. May I remember that I continue changing, and that this existence is impermanent, and how dare we be afraid of our dreams? Who am I?
So again, that was a poem called Who Am I, written and recorded by CJ. From an early age, CJ struggled with serious health complications. CJ and his twin sister were born 8 weeks premature, weighing only 4 pounds, 2 ounces each. CJ was also born with asthma. At 8 months old, CJ was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, which required brain surgery to heal. He then developed a hernia, which required a second surgery. Soon after, he caught the chickenpox. This all occurred before his first birthday. In the words of his mother, CJ is a miracle. He has always been a miracle. Next slide, please. Besides suffering from severe asthma, CJ went on to live a relatively healthy life. He grew up just outside of Philadelphia, playing basketball and music, with a special affinity for the saxophone and ukulele. Friends and family described CJ as full of love and light, a bountiful soul, and an incredibly magnetic humanitarian. His mom notes that even as a child, CJ identified with people on the streets, regardless of background, and that he easily connected with folks and empathized with their struggles. Next slide, please. CJ attended Syracuse University, where he studied biology and pre-medicine with the intention of becoming a doctor. In college, however, he learned more about the flaws of Western medicine and the U.S. healthcare system, as well as some of the virtues of indigenous medicines and alternative forms of healing. Through his studies, CJ learned more about the injustices in our society and environment, which inspired him to become more involved in organizing and activism. At Syracuse, CJ helped to organize 2 major student movements: the General Body Sit-In, in which students occupied the university's administrative buildings to demand more transparency and resources for marginalized students, and the Syracuse Divestment Campaign, a successful campaign which led the university to divest their endowment from fossil fuel corporations. Next slide, please. CJ was motivated by what he learned in college to change the world for the better. After graduating in 2015, he decided not to pursue medical school. Instead, he moved to Thailand to study organic farming and permaculture. Eventually, CJ moved to Los Angeles to live with his childhood best friend, Shira. Together, CJ and Shira began planting seeds in LA for a community centered on social justice and healing. Around this time, resistance was growing against the Dakota Access Pipeline, a $3.8 billion, 1,200-mile-long pipeline project to carry 500,000 barrels of oil daily through 4 states in the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. In 2016, activists and indigenous leaders, also known as water protectors, began organizing and established a camp near Lake Oahe for strategic peaceful protests. As tensions grew between nonviolent protesters and militarized police forces, CJ felt called to join the thousands of people amassing in North Dakota to stand in solidarity with the Sioux tribe. With the support of friends and family, CJ traveled to the front lines of the Standing Rock conflict on 3 separate occasions, living for periods at the Sacred Stone camp. We see here is a photo of CJ in the middle, protesting with fellow water protectors in North Dakota. For those who are less familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, and to provide more color, texture, and context to this struggle, I'm going to play a short clip from the documentary, Awake, A Dream from Standing Rock. Next slide, please. So hopefully that gives folks a better understanding of what CJ was a part of in Standing Rock. I want to show a few photos of CJ while at Standing Rock. And here's a photo that CJ posted with the caption, "Have the courage to stare racism, bigotry, and hatred in the face. Love, truth, and compassion are allowed to hold space as well. In fact, in these times, they should be given more space to flow to and through human beings. Never doubt the power of love." Next slide, please. And this is another photo of CJ in his favorite water protector jacket. Rather than telling you about CJ's experience at Standing Rock, I'm going to play you another video clip of CJ describing it himself, which was recorded at an Indigenous peoples gathering in Panama. Next slide, please.
Community, and so can you tell us a bit about the Standing Rock? Standing Rock, oh yes, this place is so beautiful. Do you want me to give you like the backstory of it?
Yeah, a little bit of backstory.
Sure. Okay, so Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. So there was this pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and originally it was supposed to go through Bismarck, which is a largely white and largely affluent area in North Dakota. And they say, no, we don't want this pipeline. We fear that it will rupture and poison our drinking water. And so they say, okay, we move it to the Indian reservation. And then when these people say, no, we don't want this pipeline, like we fear it'll rupture and it'll poison our drinking water, they say, no, it's fine, this will be like state-of-the-art material, this will be top of the line, that won't rupture. Mind you, Enbridge, the company who is in charge of Dakota Access Pipeline, is like the most polluting, they're known for the most pipeline breaks. Like I think they had 200 last year. And largely these pipelines don't go reported. When pipelines rupture, it's not like we're hearing it on the front page of the news. We hear about the big ones like the BP oil spill, but these are very common, and it's really quite bizarre. It's like they're trying to, in ways, oil is so old. It's such an old structure. There's so many renewable forms of energy that are showing themselves, that have been showing themselves for many generations, but we think of Nikola Tesla. We think of like beings who have figured out how to harness energy from this earth to provide for everyone, but this isn't the most profitable. And we see that in activism, when you reach into the roots of the problems of humankind, they all boil down to very few structures and entities and beings and companies, and you see that in oil companies and pharmaceutical companies and in the industrial agriculture business. A lot of these companies control the world in many ways and are controlled by people who control the world. And so this is why something like Standing Rock is very dangerous to the status quo, because it reaches into the oil companies being, and they don't like this. And so Standing Rock, the Sioux tribe, which is known for their resistance, known for, back in the days of Sitting Bull and back in the days when the Wild Wild West, as they told us as a kid, the Lakota were tribes who fought back very well. They're known for winning the Battle of Little Bighorn against General Custer, like one of the most iconic wins in the American Indian Wars. And so this just seems like with Standing Rock a continuation of that, like in this generation's form. But these people, tribes from all over the world, over 300 tribes from all over the world, like gather on the sacred land in random North Dakota. There's not much out there but Great Plains, and people come in ceremony. I've been an activist for years, but I've never seen activism that is ceremony. People praying and people talking and gathering around the sacred fire and sharing meals and sharing stories and sharing music. And Standing Rock's intense on the front lines, like seeing militarized police forces, attacking people, beating people, macing people, protecting private interests over human life. And, the people who have gathered in Standing Rock are not simply protecting their drinking water. They're protecting the drinking water of over 18 million people, or maybe it's 8 million, I think it's 8 million, who live downstream, who aren't there, who have no idea that their drinking water is at risk. And this often becomes the case, and it's often indigenous people and people of color who are fighting for, like, the rights of all of us, but the oppressors, the system, have done a very good job at disconnecting it. Like, so having people think, well, it's not happening to me right now, so, like, it's okay, it's distant from me. The illusion of separation, that they have, like, very, very, very beautifully put into the consciousness of the masses. But Standing Rock shows the potential that we all have to awaken, Standing Rock provided a spark of hope. It showed that, like, hey, we're not just going to, like, stand by idly and watch you destroy this earth. We are idle no more. People risked their lives. People dropped everything that they were doing and went to Standing Rock. Like, people dropped their livelihoods. I know people who didn't go to work, people who left their homes, people who left their jobs, to be and stand for the sacred waters, to get arrested, to be charged with potential felonies and years in prison. One woman had her arm almost blown off. Another woman is blind in her eyes. People are leaving with lots of trauma and lots of things, but overall it has lit a fire in many hearts, not only in Standing Rock but around the world, where people see that this kind of activism is possible. Like when I originally learned about environmentalism, I learned that I thought it was just like saving plastic, like recycling and like limiting your drinking water, getting a water bottle, and things like this. But when I realized that environmentalism ties deeply in with like indigenous wisdom, and it ties deeply into like remembering our connection to the earth. And environmentalism ties into racism, and it ties into like socialism and all of these like ills of the world. We can see them intersect with environmentalism, and it becomes ever more apparent for us to really tune in as a collective and as individuals to what's going on in the world, and not think that it's separate from us, because the earth is one living entity, one living being. And so to reduce her from that is to not show her in all of her form and her beauty and grace and power. So yes, yeah.
So I hope everyone was able to see that video of CJ describing his experience at Standing Rock. You're about to hear another track, another poem that was written and recorded by CJ, and this poem is called "Breath is a Blessing."
Seems like a distant show. I know this road can feel so difficult. Seems like a distant show. I know this road can feel so difficult. But there's promise, and as long as we stay honest, patriarchy's got us violent. But no longer I won't be silent about these folks who are on assignments to separate and divide us. They lie, cause when we're united, it's impossible to fight us. Don't forget each breath is a blessing. Don't forget each step's a lesson. Climbing stairways to heaven. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, breath is a blessing. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, breath is a blessing. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, breath is a blessing. Don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget, breath is a blessing. My hope that we can remember that we cannot do something to someone else without that same thing happening to us. We cannot point one finger of judgment because we have 3 more fingers pointing back at us. We must remember that we are all in this thing called life together.
Great. I hope everyone was able to see that video and hear that poem. Again, Breath is a Blessing from CJ. Next slide, please. So CJ returned from Standing Rock motivated, but also cash-strapped and traumatized. The 3 trips to North Dakota have been physically exhausting, emotionally challenging, and financially draining. After a few more months living in Los Angeles, CJ decided to spend the season farming in Northern California. In October of 2017, 250 wildfires blazed during the Northern California firestorm. 245,000 acres burned, killing 44 people and hospitalizing 192 others, making this one of the deadliest wildfire events in U.S. history. The fires were also among the costliest in U.S. history, destroying 5,700 homes and costing the U.S. economy at least $85 billion. The preconditions for these deadly and destructive fires were laid by years of extreme drought caused by a severe shortage of rainfall, which is widely understood by scientists to be a byproduct of anthropogenic climate change. Rapid winds helped spark the fires, and flawed land use, development, utility, and forest management practices also increased fire risk. Next slide, please. Wildfires pose another significant public health hazard: poor air quality. Wildfires produce high levels of particulate matter and ozone, which are unhealthy and particularly dangerous for vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions such as asthma. During the Northern California firestorm, the EPA declared that the air quality in some areas was hazardous, the most dangerous level on the agency's scale. Unhealthy air quality in other parts of the state forced hundreds to the emergency room, and governments across the region closed schools and canceled flights, citing air quality concerns. Next slide, please. CJ was working on a farm in Northern California when the regional firestorm erupted. As the fires intensified, he began having trouble breathing. On October 12th, CJ called his friend Shira to tell her that someone was driving him to the nearest hospital because he was having trouble breathing. On the phone, CJ sounded like he was struggling and in a lot of pain. On the way to the hospital, CJ stopped breathing, and his brain stopped receiving oxygen. His final words to Shira were, "I can't breathe." CJ arrived at the hospital showing no signs of life. At the hospital, CJ was resuscitated and put on life support. His mother received a call shortly after, not knowing what had just occurred. The doctors asked her what she wanted them to do, and she begged them to save her son. Next slide, please. Since CJ's incident, many lives have been lost to unnatural fires in California. In 2018 alone, fires killed 110 more people, destroyed 18,000 more homes, and burned nearly 2 million more acres of land. Every person who died in these fires and every family who lost a home has a story. I encourage everyone to tell more stories and to listen to them as well. In just 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, California experienced 6 of the 10 most destructive wildfires in state history. According to Yale Climate Connections, scientific evidence clearly shows that climate change is exacerbating California's wildfires in different ways, including higher temperatures, which dry out vegetation and create more fuel. Climate change shortens the rainy season, thus extending the fire season. And climate change also shifts the Santa Ana winds that fan wildfires. And this is just in California. The infographic you see from The Guardian shows that in 2018 alone, nearly 5,000 more people were killed by other climate disasters across the world. Millions more have been impacted by climate change every year, including an untold number of climate refugees who have been displaced from their homes and forced to migrate. Next slide, please. Research shows that globally, the countries most impacted by climate change are the ones that have contributed the least to the problem. In the US, climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities and disproportionately impact marginalized communities, particularly poor communities of color. In response, mass movements are mobilizing for climate justice and a just transition to a clean energy economy that centers equity. Climate justice builds on a rich history of environmental justice research and organizing. In some cases, climate change adds an additional level of urgency and severity to existing environmental justice struggles. For example, in the United States, your race best predicts whether you live next to contaminated air, water, or soil. According to the CDC, 15% of Black children in the US have asthma, compared to only 7% of white children, a disparity resulting from inequities in the built environment and exposure to pollution. Climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of wildfires, creating smoke and toxic air pollution that especially endangers asthma patients who are disproportionately Black, poor, and young. Next slide, please. All these phenomena are interconnected and fall under the umbrella of structural or systemic racism. The facts are insurmountable. For example, for every dollar of wealth held by a white household, Black households have only 10 cents. The wealth gap is shrinking at a sluggish pace. If it continues at the current rate, it will take 228 years to close the wealth gap between Black and white families. According to the ACLU, Black people are 3.7 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana, despite roughly equal usage rates. Black folks are also 12 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of drug crimes compared to white folks. According to the CDC, the average life expectancy is 3.5 years longer for white people than for Black people. The statistics go on and on. Next slide, please. Trigger warning, the video you are about to see is violent and graphic. It's the now infamous 2014 video of Eric Garner, a father of 7, being strangled to death by the police. The video may be triggering for some folks, so feel free to look away if you need to, but I feel it is important to show the reality of police bias and abuse in the US. So in the video, you see NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo approach Mr. Garner and put him in a band chokehold. In the video, you see Mr. Garner utter the phrase, "I can't breathe," while multiple NYPD officers are on top of him. But this video is cut short. Mr. Garner, who suffers from asthma, actually repeated the phrase, "I can't breathe," 11 times before going into cardiac arrest. Officers called an ambulance, but refused to perform CPR. He was pronounced dead an hour later at the hospital. 5 years later, Officer Pantaleo is still an NYPD officer. He is still on payroll. He was never indicted for killing Mr. Garner. To learn more about why it's so hard to indict police officers in the United States, I encourage folks to listen to the Breakdown podcast with Sean King and the North Star, particularly episodes 12 to 14, which explain the Supreme Court cases that make justice for police killings and abuse nearly impossible. On this slide, you see Erica Garner. She is one of Eric Garner's 6 children. After her father was killed, she boldly and courageously organized to demand justice for her father. She also helped make I Can't Breathe an internationally recognized slogan for police accountability. Like her father, Erica also suffered from severe asthma. Tragically, Erica died of asthma-related causes at age 27, just 2 years after her father was choked to death. Next slide, please. Racism and inequality are ever present in our society. I Can't Breathe is not only a rallying cry against police brutality, but also a call to combat environmental injustice, climate change, and suffocating systems of oppression. Breath is a human right. All people deserve access to quality air. No one should be denied the right to breathe freely, regardless of race, income, neighborhood, or any other factor. The systems perpetuating climate change are connected to the systems perpetuating poverty, environmental racism, and police brutality. They are all a part of the same interconnected system. In the words of Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. Until we change the system or create new ones altogether, we will continue to lose loved ones, especially those already disadvantaged, marginalized, and vulnerable to climate change, white supremacy, colonization, and other forms of systemic violence. Next slide, please. On October 12th, 2017, CJ called his friend Shira to tell her that he was having a severe asthma attack. Like Eric Garner, his last words were, "I can't breathe." Today, 1 year, 8 months, and 15 days since the incident, CJ remains in a coma. He lives in a nursing home just outside of Philadelphia. He is unable to walk or speak or breathe without and eat without breathing and feeding tubes. CJ suffered a severe brain damage from losing the flow of oxygen to his brain. Doctors think it is unlikely that CJ will recover, but his family remains faithful and they continue to pray for a miracle. Next slide, please. Despite all this, CJ taught me to be hopeful. Hopeful that we can become more conscious and compassionate individually and collectively. It starts by recognizing that we are all connected through our shared experience as human beings on planet Earth. With this shared understanding, we can come together to change the system and fight for the rights of all people. CJ also taught me to fight back. Fight back through art, organizing, ceremony, storytelling, and creative, peaceful protest. Finally, CJ taught me to believe in something better. He continues to inspire me to be a better person and to work vigorously for a better world, a world we can all believe in. I hope he inspires you to do the same. Thank you all for taking time today and for listening to this story. If you want to learn more about CJ, you can visit thecjproject.com. You can also listen to CJ read more of his poetry on a beautiful EP called The Colton Light, which you can find on SoundCloud and Spotify, which was produced by his friend John after the incident. I'm going to conclude today with a final poem from CJ titled Art of the Evolution, aka Heart of the Revolution.
We all must question. And these questions don't necessarily have to have answers, but the question will bring us movement on our quest. And where that quest is going is reminding us, or sort of having us ask the question of who are we? Why are we here? This system is run by greed. This system is run by people trying to get one up on one another, people trying to find a superior edge. We're so individualistic. We're chasing individual success, individual freedom, individual joy and happiness. If one of us is oppressed, we are all oppressed. If one of us goes hungry or thirsty, we are all going hungry or thirsty. Most of the indigenous took in their new visitors with open arms. They didn't understand the non-flow of reciprocity. They didn't understand what we know as wettical. Wettical is the sickness of the mind that the indigenous noticed that the white man came over with. It's described as when one takes more than one needs. What nature shows us, and what the universe shows us, and what love shows us, and what community shows us, what the movement shows us, is that when we come together, there's absolutely nothing that we can do. When we come together, there is no dream that we cannot materialize. Believe in something better.
And this is Lauren again. Before we go forward, I think we should first pause for a moment to send some thoughts to CJ and his family and friends as a thanks for their willingness to share CJ's story, art, and words with us.
Yes, thank you.
I also want to say thank you so much to Keegan for telling CJ's story today and working with us to bring it to the National Adaptation Forum Network. At this point, we will open up for any reflections or questions people may have. Please send your questions through the question function or raise your hand and we will unmute you. And I will start it off with this question that has come in. Keegan, how did you come to telling this story, and what is the bigger picture in sharing this?
Thank you. I came to tell this story. Enterprise Community Partners, who I work for, we do work around resilience and climate resilience around the country. And we were on a call with members of our team from around the country who are doing work related to climate resilience and affordable housing. And someone opened up the floor, this was after the wildfires in 2018, to just hold space for the victims of the wildfires and asked if anyone had anything to share or any personal connections to the fires. And I felt compelled to share this with team members from across the country, just briefly share what had happened to CJ. And folks were really moved and wanted to hear more and learn more about his story. So I wrote this all in an article. And in that article, I also was uncovering more and more about the connection between wildfires and climate change and structural racism and the significance of the phrase, "I can't breathe." So I wrote the story, and in an effort to get it published and lift up his story to a wider audience, the folks at National Adaptation Forum read it and asked if I would share this story on this webinar. So hopefully the article will also be published in written format at some point so that we can continue to lift up CJ's story and share more stories. And I think this is really important because as everyone who I've shared this story with or who has read the article that I wrote, or Shira has also told the story in her own way a number of times, as has CJ's mother, Stephanie. I think it's really important that we share stories rather than just numbers, as I mentioned, in order to really humanize the issue and to remind us that these are individual human beings that are being impacted and not just numbers. So I think that's why it's really important, and I think it also speaks to our emotions, which are much more likely to motivate us than numbers and statistics. So yeah, that's sort of the background.
Thank you. And jumping off from that, how do you think that storytelling helps communicate about climate change?
Yeah, again, I think that so often we hear about climate change in the context of ice caps and ocean acidification and polar bears, and we might hear macroeconomic terms about the economic impact of climate change and all of this modeling, and it can be really abstract. It can be very scientific and inaccessible. And I think as so many people are impacted in really significant ways around the world, it's really important that we share our stories in order to motivate people to act now, because we know we have a really small window to act before things get a whole lot worse, and to also acknowledge that climate change is already happening and it's already impacting people and it's already taking human lives. And I was reminded of this at the National Adaptation Forum. There were, in particular, some folks from a tribe in Alaska whose whole town was going underwater, and they were having to consider and try to figure out how they can move their entire people to higher ground. So I think it's immensely important that we always use stories to pair with the data and the reports, which are also important.
Thank you so much. Looks like we have one more question coming through. This is from Ella at the NRDC. She said, I went to college with CJ, and we were both in the general body and the divest SU, and also a friend. Sometimes in times of trouble, people are represented as better than they were in reality. But CJ was truly a leader, a healer, a friend, and he practiced radical kindness and love to achieve the change. Thanks so much, Ella, for telling that.
Thank you, Ella. That's so beautiful. I would love to connect with you, and thank you. I'm so glad you're here as well and can share that with everyone. It's amazing, really. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Nope, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's amazing how many lives CJ was able to touch in his short life. I've met so many people and been connected to so many people through this one individual, and it's really amazing. So I know that his message and his legacy lives on.
Yes, she also said that he is CJ is also who I think of when I think of climate and its cost on human health. Thanks again. And then our last question is from Chas. There's a little bit of an introduction. It says, thank you for telling CJ's story. It was certainly a powerful story of an amazing and inspiring individual. I look forward to reading your article. Thank you. I completely agree with you that it's imperative that we learn to catalog and tell our stories about climate impacts to our friends and communities. Are you aware of any online repositories for climate stories?
Thank you. That is a great question and idea. I haven't had the time yet to investigate that thoroughly. So no, I'm not sure if it exists. Hopefully we can be a part of it. And if it doesn't, I hope we can create it.
Well, as we are coming up to 3 p.m., I'm going to close up the webinar for the day. Thank you. Thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us. This webinar and all of the National Adaptation Forum webinars can be found on our website and on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. We will send you a link once it's posted online. Please feel free to share with colleagues who could not attend today's broadcast once the recorded version is posted. In addition to the webinar recording, CAKE, which is found at cakex.org, is home to hundreds of adaptation resources, including case studies related to today's panel. So when you go to share the recording of today's webinar, check out everything else on cakex.org. The National Adaptation Forum webinar series are run quarterly. If you would like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering with the National Adaptation Forum webinar series, please email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. On behalf of EcoAdapt, thank you for tuning in and have a great day. Thanks again, Keegan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And if I may,
Thank you,
I would just like to say thank you one more time to CJ and to his mother, Stephanie Jones, who I spoke with a number of times, and sharing this story, and to his friend CJ, or to his friend Shira, and his other friend John, who produced the tracks. And thank you all so much for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.